Many valuers find themselves a bit in the dark when it comes to appraising the foundations of residential properties. With this video, we'd like to shed a little more light on the subject. We're not aiming to turn you into experts, but we do hope to give you a better understanding of what to look out for down under. Since repiling is often the single most expensive repair job around the home, it's hardly surprising that most clients are keen to know whether they're likely to have any serious foundations problems on their hands. What they often get, though, is this. Right. A very quick nosy into the basement, which the valuer uses as a basis for stating in his report something like, "The house appears to be on concrete." In two goes a disclaimer about it not being a structural report. Apart from this treatment of foundations falling short of the client's expectations, the disclaimer itself is not quite as watertight as it might appear. Where it comes to litigation, the courts have sometimes found that, notwithstanding the disclaimer, the valuers concerned failed in their duty of care. In other words, the court felt these valuers had failed to identify problems which the client could have reasonably expected them to find. Of course, the word reasonable is open to interpretation, but there's little doubt that some courts and a lot of clients feel valuers should at least be familiar with the problem signs, make the necessary effort to spot them, and where they appear serious, suggest the client seeks expert advice. Every valuer, it seems, has their own method of inspection, but for the purpose of this video, we'll look at foundations in a logical sequence that will allow a thorough check of the property. A good habit to get into when you first arrive at a property is to take 5 minutes or so and size up the surrounding area. Look at the general terrain, ground contours, gullies which might have been filled, any excavations, evidence of subsidence, the type of vegetation and soil, and neighbouring houses. These will often provide valuable pointers to potential problems with the property being inspected. It's a good idea to keep a pair of overalls and a good pair of gumboots in the boot. It's also good to have handy a decent torch, a screwdriver for the odd bit of probing, and a pad and clipboard for notes. We're all set. At the heart of most foundations problems is this: water, or moisture of some kind, reacting either on the foundations themselves or on the surrounding soil. We'll talk about soil a little bit later on, but you can be fairly certain that where there are signs of dampness, such as leaking pipes, blocked drains or runoff, especially around older houses on timber piles, there are going to be problems. If the dwelling sits on a perimeter wall, cracking or weeping can be an indication that all is not well. And walls which tilt or bow like this are usually a sign that the earth behind them is unstable. In many cases, this comes from using poor quality or uncompacted fill or inadequate drainage. Subsidence can also be visible in properties with ground undulations, uneven pathways, ground coming away from drains, and gaps beneath buildings. Do-it-yourself excavators can also cause subsidence problems. Here, a bank was excavated for a garage, but the bank was left exposed for 2 months. After a spell of wet weather, down it all came, severely undermining the adjoining property. The type of soil present has a strong bearing on foundations, with clays, especially deep clays, being pretty much the baddie of the piece. Deep clays are found in pockets throughout the country. Because they are capable of absorbing and getting rid of large quantities of moisture, clays have a high shrinkage and swelling rate. Obviously, all this movement isn't ideal for foundations, and in these situations it's important that the foundations are sunk below the depth of the shrinking material. Peaty soils are also capable of excessive movement and don't have much bearing capacity. Normally, peat is dug out to a depth specified by an engineer and replaced with sand. Sandy soils are a much better proposition for foundations because sand gets rid of moisture very quickly. Therefore, there's negligible movement. And unlike clays, where settlement can take years, new houses constructed on sandy soils are normally completely settled by the time building is completed. As well as these soils, there are silts, gravels, various types of rock and volcanic material, and other more specialised soil types. Trees are a welcome addition to any garden, but they can be real sponges. A fully grown poplar, for instance, soaks up 50,000 litres of water every year. It's a lot of moisture coming out of the ground, and if large trees like this are close to the house, they can dry out and shrink the ground, causing the foundations at that point to subside. That's more likely to happen on clay soils. This action can also work in reverse if trees or large quantities of vegetation are removed from clay soils close to foundations. Then you have a gradual swelling as the water returns to the ground. The signs of subsidence are often written on the houses. With weatherboard houses, a glance along the weatherboards themselves will show whether there are any dips. Now, these dips are often caused by the pile beneath subsiding, and taking the weatherboard, which is secured to the stud, down with it. With inflexible materials like brick, however, subsidence will probably cause cracking, and gaps will often appear between the cladding and windows and doors. If the signs of foundations problems aren't too numerous outside, there's a good chance you'll pick up some clues inside. The first obvious place to look is at the doors and windows. Just a glance at some will suggest a subsidence problem. Then there are doors that like to shut themselves. Opening the odd window or door, or trying to, is another useful exercise. A further giveaway can be sloping floors, and on smooth surfaces like this, a marble dropped onto the floor tends to roll in the direction of the subsidence. Uneven floors don't always indicate bad foundations. It could be possible, for instance, that the house has been repiled but not re-levelled, or that there was some ground settlement initially, but that's now finished. Generally, where there are chimneys present, the slope will be away from the chimney, simply because chimney foundations are so robust. Other clues to subsidence are large items of furniture on a lean, wallpaper which is buckled or askew, or cracked scotia. Excessive floor movement might be worth a follow-up as well when you take a look below. In rooms built over a cutaway section of a bank, there's a greater chance of moisture problems from things like poor ventilation, runoff, low clearance from the ground, and little sunlight. If the piles underneath are old timber, there's a strong chance they'll be damaged, and possibly the bearers too. These holes will be sufficient to get the piles out, but to get the bearers out, you'd probably have to take up the whole floor. Appearances, they say, can be very deceiving. A lot of old piles, by the way, the majority are rough hewn totara or puriri, look okay. But when you stick a screwdriver in below ground level, you find they're almost rotted through. It would be a worry if the support of your house relied on timber like this. Here's another timber bugbear, good old-fashioned borer. I know they say no house ever fell down because of borer damage, but in reality, demolition orders have been made on occasion when infestation has been particularly bad. The borer most of us have to live with is this chappie here. He makes neat little round holes. And these larger, more oval holes are the work of his more dangerous cousin, the two-tooth. If allowed to go unchecked, the two-tooth can reduce timber to the consistency of wet bread. Not a happy prospect, especially if it's munching away in load-bearing timber like bearers, joists or studs. Here's the handiwork of a very different pest, Homo sapien do-it-yourselfus. With his jumble of assorted blocks, he's a very dangerous beast to let loose in the basement. This should really be professional territory. Far from the gaze of the building inspector, some highly unorthodox forms of excavation take place as well, with varying degrees of success. Do-it-yourselfers aren't the only ones that turn out inadequate jobs. Builders have been known to take the odd shortcut too. This Auckland house, for instance, is sitting only on lightweight masonry blocks, which aren't designed for this purpose. Another little trick sometimes used is to just put short lengths of reinforcing steel into the concrete, and then as soon as the building inspector or valuer has left, simply knock them out again. Houses on concrete pads are a bit tricky to squeeze under, and you can't exactly rip up the carpet or linoleum to inspect them. Normally, though, some areas are left exposed, like porches or garages, where you can look for signs of cracks. Hairline cracks like this are fairly common, but if they are larger than hairline, there's a good chance the crack penetrates right through the slab. This could be caused by subsidence or inadequate steel reinforcement. Well, we've seen our share of inadequate foundations. Now let's have a look at some good ones. Here's a typical precast concrete pile. It's got a solid footing, it's standing square and level. There's a damp-proof membrane inserted, it's got wedges, and it's fastened securely to the bearer. It's quite okay to leave some of the old wooden piles in to allow the new piles to settle in, but not if the old piles are beneath where the bearers join, because that's where you need strong support. For new building work, the usual and best practice is to secure foundations to bearers by means of reinforcing steel. The specifications and standards required for this, and most other work on light timber frame buildings, is contained in Building Code New Zealand Standard 3604. Trying to absorb all the information in Building Code New Zealand Standard 3604 would be a pretty tall order, but a familiarity with areas you regularly come into contact with can be useful. At least have a copy to refer to. Whether concrete or correctly treated timber is preferable depends very largely on the circumstances. Concrete is certainly durable, and it's generally more attractive to most potential buyers and lending institutions. Although I did hear one suggest that as long as the foundation outlasts the mortgage, it doesn't really matter what it's made of. Treated timber, on the other hand, is more flexible in its uses, and it's easier to cart around, especially in difficult access situations. The correct treatment is set out in New Zealand Standard 3602. The tendency these days is to move away from round timber piles to square ones, because they're easier to work with. Correct bracing is very important to counter horizontal movement, especially earthquakes. There should be bracing at least every 5 meters in each direction, and the angle of the bracing shouldn't exceed 45 degrees. Every pole house is a unique piece of engineering design, taking careful account of slope, height, mass of the structure, and many other factors. Problems only occur when owners decide to do some excavating without an engineer. That can easily put the stability of the house at risk. There are a number of other specialised types of foundations that take account of regional factors. Also dotted around are areas that have particular problems like shrinking clays, flood-prone areas or badly filled areas. If you're not familiar with them, I'm sure your local building inspector, engineers or repilers will happily supply the details. Well, that's foundations, the good, the bad and the ugly. Their appearance is important, certainly to clients, but also to valuers. The aim here has been to help you spot potential or existing problems so that your clients can be made aware of them and seek further expert opinion. I hope that we've encouraged you to dig a little deeper.